Claire Brennan crouched behind the furnace in the basement, her hand clamped over Ethan's mouth. 5 years old, and he wanted to ask why. Wanted to know what the sounds meant. But her grip told him everything he needed to understand about staying quiet. Above them, floorboards creaked under deliberate weight. Someone was searching the house she'd inherited from a grandfather she hadn't seen in 15 years. The house everyone in town called cursed. She'd arrived at the rusted iron gates on a Tuesday afternoon in late October with $17 folded in her coat pocket and nowhere left to run. Rain had started falling the moment she parked, as if the sky itself wanted her to leave. The Victorian mansion loomed behind wrought iron like something pulled from a nightmare. Windows black and empty, vines strangling walls that might once have been white, a porch sagging under decades of neglect. 529 Maple Street. The address on the estate attorney's letter that had arrived at her post office box like a message from the dead. Ethan pressed against her leg, his small hand clutching her worn jacket. His other hand held Max, the stuffed dog they'd bought at Target back when she still had a job. Back when they had an apartment with heat and running water instead of a 15-year-old Honda with broken seats and windows that wouldn't close all the way. The boy's lips trembled, but he didn't cry. He'd learned not to cry during the 2 months they'd spent sleeping in grocery store parking lots, during the endless days at the library where they pretended everything was fine while she searched for jobs that never materialized. Everyone called this place the Dead House. Teenagers dared each other to touch the gate at midnight. Neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past after dark. Strange lights flickered in the upstairs windows, people said. Shadows moved behind curtains when no one had lived there for months. But Claire wasn't afraid of ghosts. Ghosts couldn't evict you. Ghosts didn't send collection notices or shut off your electricity or tell you the shelter wait list had 89 families ahead of you and your son. This condemned-looking structure was her last chance. Ethan hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon at the food bank, and that had been half a peanut butter sandwich and an apple with a bruise she'd cut away. Her car ran on fumes. Literally. The gas light had been on for 2 days. The last $16 in her checking account wouldn't cover another tank. This house, with its reputation for being haunted and its appearance suggesting imminent collapse, represented the end of the road. Inside those walls she'd either find shelter or admit defeat. 6 months ago, Claire's life had looked nothing like this. She'd worked as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates, a mid-size firm downtown where she'd spent 5 years building a reputation for thoroughness and discretion. $45,000 a year, health insurance, 2 weeks paid vacation. She'd come home to a small apartment in a decent neighborhood where her husband David would have dinner waiting. Nothing fancy, usually spaghetti or tacos or whatever they could afford on his warehouse salary. And Ethan would run to the door with his arms stretched wide, shouting about his day at daycare. They weren't wealthy. They drove used cars and bought clothes at discount stores and canceled streaming services when money got tight. But they had enough. They had love and routines and Friday movie nights where they'd make popcorn and watch whatever cartoon Ethan picked. They had a future that stretched out before them like a well-lit highway with clearly marked exits. A future that ended on a rainy Tuesday in April when a drunk driver ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. David's late shift at the warehouse ended at 11. He texted her a photo of the empty parking lot, said he was heading home. The next time she saw him was at the morgue, and even then they'd only let her see his face because the rest of his body had been too damaged when the SUV hit. The police officer at her door had a practice speech about instant death and no suffering, as if those words could somehow soften the impact of losing the person you'd built your entire adult life around. Claire remembered collapsing on the kitchen floor while Ethan screamed in his room. She'd made sounds she didn't recognize as human, animal noises of grief that came from somewhere deep in her chest where she'd never known pain could live. The neighbors called 911 because they thought someone was being murdered, and in a way, someone was. The version of herself that had believed the world was fundamentally fair, that good things happened to people who worked hard and played by the rules. The months after David's funeral blurred into a haze of barely functioning. Life insurance existed, but $18,000 didn't last long against $15,000 in hospital bills from those final hours when doctors had tried desperately to save someone already gone. She tried to keep working, showed up at Morrison and Associates with makeup covering the shadows under her eyes and a smile she'd practiced in the car. But her mind wouldn't cooperate. She'd stare at case files for hours without reading a single word. She missed deadlines because she spent the morning crying in the bathroom. She'd forget meetings entirely, arriving at the office to find angry voicemails asking where she'd been. Richard Morrison had been patient at first. He'd given her 2 weeks off with pay after the funeral, had sent flowers and a card about David being in a better place now. But law firms don't run on sympathy. They run on billable hours and client satisfaction and the expectation that everyone will function like machines regardless of personal circumstances. After 3 months of mistakes and missed deadlines, Morrison had called her into his office with an expression that told her everything before he opened his mouth. He was sorry. He truly was. But they needed someone reliable, someone who could handle the pressure. They'd give her 2 weeks severance and a good reference. His door was always open if she needed anything. The words were kind, but the message was clear. She was done. Losing her job meant losing her apartment. The lease required proof of employment, and without that the landlord had no interest in letting her stay. $850 a month had seemed affordable when she and David were both working. On unemployment benefits that barely covered groceries, it became impossible. She'd sent out dozens of resumes, had gone to interviews where hiring managers looked at her sympathetically before explaining that the employment gap was concerning, that they needed someone who could handle stress without falling apart. One man at a bank had actually said that to her face, those exact words, and she'd smiled and thanked him for his time and then cried all the way home. By the time the eviction notice arrived, she'd already sold most of their furniture. The apartment had become a ghost of itself. Empty rooms echoing with memories of when it had felt like home. She'd been living on crackers and canned soup, feeding Ethan whatever she could afford at dollar stores, avoiding calls from friends because she couldn't bear their pity or their well-meaning advice to just stay positive. She and Ethan moved into the Honda on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She'd packed everything they still owned into garbage bags and stacked them in the trunk, then driven to a grocery store parking lot where she'd heard homeless people could park overnight without being hassled. The first night Ethan had thought it was an adventure. Camping, she'd called it, like they were on vacation. She'd held him while he slept across the back seat, whispering promises she didn't know if she could keep telling him they'd have a real home again soon. The shelters were always full. Every day she'd call the hotlines, adding her name to wait lists that never seemed to move. So many others had fallen through the cracks, just like her. Single parents and veterans and people who'd lost jobs to medical emergencies or factory closures or just bad luck. She'd take Ethan to public libraries during the day where it was warm and she could use computers to search for jobs that never called back. The librarians were kind. They never said anything about how often Claire and Ethan came, how long they stayed, how they lingered until closing time. One older woman named Ruth would slip Ethan cookies when she thought Claire wasn't looking. And those small acts of kindness were sometimes the only thing that kept Claire from giving up entirely. Then came the letter. She'd been checking her post office box every few days, the one expense she'd kept because she needed somewhere to receive mail. When she found the thick manila envelope with a law firm's return address, her first thought was another bill, another reminder of everything she couldn't pay. She almost threw it away unopened. But something made her break the seal, unfold the stiff legal documents inside, and read through language designed to make simple things incomprehensible. It took 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. Her grandfather, Malcolm Voss, had died 8 months ago. The letter was from his estate attorney informing her that she was the sole heir to his property at 529 Maple Street. The house had been sitting empty since his death, accumulating dust and back taxes. If she wanted to claim it, she needed to contact the law office within 30 days to sign transfer documents. Claire sat in her car with Ethan sleeping in the back seat and stared at the letter until the words stopped making sense. Her grandfather. She hadn't seen him in 15 years. Not since she was a teenager caught in the middle of one of those family rifts that seemed insurmountable at the time. Her mother had wanted to move to the city, go to college, escape the small-town life Malcolm represented. He'd been overprotective and old-fashioned, wanting her close, and they'd fought about everything. Curfews, boyfriends, college choices, independence. The details seemed so small now, so easily resolvable. But at the time, they had felt like impassable mountains of hurt and stubborn pride. Her mother had forbidden contact with Malcolm, and Claire, young and loyal, had complied. By the time she was old enough to make her own choices, life had gotten in the way. College, marriage, work, Ethan. She'd thought about calling her grandfather, had looked up his number dozens of times, but never found the courage to dial. Now he was gone, and all she had was this letter and a house she'd never seen. At the law office the next morning, the receptionist had processed her paperwork with professional efficiency. Everything seemed routine until Claire stood to leave. The woman had leaned across her desk, voice dropping to a whisper. Her words came out rushed, as if she'd been holding them back and couldn't anymore. "Are you sure you want that house? The last 3 people who tried to claim it, bad things happened to them." Claire had forced a smile and said she didn't believe in curses, but the woman's expression suggested she should. The warning stayed with her as she drove to Maple Street that afternoon, Ethan asking questions from the back seat. Where were they going? Was it a real house? Would he have his own room? Could they get a dog? Questions she couldn't answer because she didn't know what waited for them at the end of this dead-end street. The neighborhood had been respectable 50 years ago. You could see it in the bones of the houses, in the wide lots and mature trees, but time and economic decline had taken their toll. Some houses were boarded up, others had overgrown yards and peeling paint. The street itself was lined with bare November trees, their branches skeletal against the gray sky that seemed to press down like a weight. Number 529 sat at the very end, separated from its neighbors by a high wooden fence that had collapsed in several places. The house itself looked like something from a horror movie. 2 stories of Victorian architecture that must have been beautiful once, but now seemed like a corpse propped upright by sheer stubbornness. The porch sagged under its own weight, shutters hung at odd angles, and the whole structure leaned slightly to the left as if exhausted from standing for so long. Claire parked in the weed-choked driveway and sat for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. This was her inheritance. Not a tidy suburban home with a manicured lawn. Not a cozy cottage with flower boxes and fresh paint. This dark, looming structure that looked like it might collapse if she breathed too hard. Ethan's voice from the back seat mixed fear and excitement in equal measure. "It looks like a monster house." Claire tried to sound confident, like she believed what she was saying. "It's just old. Old houses always look scary, but they're just buildings. There's nothing to be afraid of." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. The attorney's office had given her 3 keys on a tarnished brass ring. The gate opened with a shriek of rusted hinges that made her wince. They walked up a cracked concrete path past dead flower beds and a broken bird bath toward the front door with its faded red paint and tarnished brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Claire tried the first key. It didn't fit. The second one slid in but wouldn't turn. The third key clicked, and the door swung inward with a groan that seemed to come from the house itself. The smell hit her first. Dust and mildew and something sweet rotten like fruit left too long in the sun. She found a light switch and flicked it, not expecting anything but bulbs flickered on in the hallway. The electricity still worked. Small miracle. The interior was a time capsule from the 1970s. Floral wallpaper in shades of orange and brown. Shag carpet worn thin along pathways between rooms. Heavy wooden furniture that looked handmade and incredibly old. Everything was covered in dust thick enough to write your name in. Cobwebs draped from corners like party decorations. And when Claire walked forward, her footsteps left prints on the floor as if she were the first person to walk here in years. Then she saw the chair. Living room, facing the door, positioned as if someone had been sitting there recently. The dust around it was disturbed, scuffed marks on the floor suggesting recent movement. Claire's pulse quickened. The house was supposed to have been empty for 8 months. Ethan's hand tightened in hers, his whisper loud in the silence. "Mama, someone lives here." Claire kept her voice steady, not wanting to scare him more. "No baby. It's been empty. Just dust settling, that's all." But she didn't believe it, and neither did he. They explored room by room, Claire's awareness heightened to every sound and shadow. The living room had a massive stone fireplace furniture covered with yellowed sheets, built-in bookshelves lined with books whose titles she couldn't read through the dust. Family photos on the mantel showed people she didn't recognize, or did she? There was Malcolm, younger than she remembered, standing next to a woman who must have been Evelyn. There was her mother as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. The kitchen had ancient appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum. Linoleum floors with a pattern that might have been cheerful once. A breakfast nook with windows looking onto an overgrown backyard where what might have been a garden had gone wild. On the counter sat a glass of water. Not dusty, fresh or recent enough to still have condensation on the sides. Claire's blood ran cold. Someone had been here. Maybe was still here. She picked up the glass with trembling hands. The water was room temperature, but the condensation hadn't fully evaporated. This glass had been filled within the last few hours. She set it down carefully, as if it were evidence at a crime scene, and pulled Ethan closer. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. The master had a 4-poster bed that dominated the space. Covers disturbed as if someone had slept there recently. On the nightstand, a newspaper. Claire picked it up with trembling hands, her heart already knowing what she'd find. The date 3 days ago. Someone had been living in her house. The realization hit her like a physical blow. All those weeks the house had sat empty. According to the attorney, someone had been here. Eating, sleeping, reading the newspaper. Watching, waiting for what? A sound from downstairs. Footsteps slow and deliberate. Not trying to be quiet. Claire grabbed Ethan and pulled him into the closet, closing the door until only a crack remained. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought whoever was down there must be able to hear it. Through the crack she could see the bedroom door, could hear the footsteps move through rooms below. Heard doors opening and closing, then silence. Long minutes passed. 5, 10. Claire's legs cramped from crouching, but she didn't dare move. Finally, when the silence had stretched so long she thought maybe she'd imagined the whole thing, she dared to emerge. Ethan followed, his face pale but trusting. If Mama said it was safe, it was safe. When they came back downstairs, the front door stood open. She'd locked it. She was certain she'd locked it. The cool November air flowed in, carrying the smell of rain and dead leaves. And on the kitchen table where the glass of water had been, now sat a note. Paper yellowed with age, handwriting shaky but legible. Claire unfolded it with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. "Leave while you still can. A friend." Claire stood in that kitchen, holding Ethan against her side, and understood that whatever she'd inherited, it was more than just a house. It was a mystery, a warning, and possibly a threat. But where else could they go? The Honda had less than a quarter tank of gas. She had $17 and no job prospects. Every shelter in the city had wait lists measured in weeks or months. This house, cursed or not, haunted or not, was the only roof available to keep the rain off her son's head. She folded the note and put it in her pocket. Then she did what she'd learned to do over the past 6 months of survival. She adapted. They'd stay. They'd be careful. They'd figure out who was watching and why. But they wouldn't run. Not yet. Not until she'd exhausted every other option. The next morning brought Adelaide Whitmore. Claire was examining the front porch, trying to determine which boards were rotten and which might still hold weight, when an elderly woman appeared at the gate carrying a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. 78 years old, maybe 80, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a cardigan despite the cold and walked with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to trust their balance completely. She introduced herself as Mrs. Whitmore said she'd lived 3 houses down for 40 years. Her voice carried the flat vowels of someone who'd been born here and never left. Didn't expect anyone to actually move in. The others never stayed. Claire's grip tightened on Ethan's shoulder. Others? Adelaide Whitmore studied Claire's face as if measuring her resolve, deciding how much truth she could handle. Your grandfather's estate went to 3 cousins before you. Each one tried to claim the house. Each left within 2 weeks. The question came out sharper than Claire intended. Why? The old woman hesitated, glancing back at her own house as if checking whether anyone was listening. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to just above a whisper. Accidents, break-ins, threatening letters. One of them, a man named Robert. Something he had his car tampered with. Brakes failed going down Henderson Hill. He survived, but that was the end of his interest in the property. She paused, seeming to make a decision. Malcolm was a good man, one of the best I ever knew. But this house, it has history people want buried. Things Malcolm knew, things he kept locked away. Not everyone was happy about that. Claire felt cold, despite the morning sun. What things? Adelaide Whitmore shook her head. He never told me specifics, but there's an attic room Malcolm kept locked for as long as I can remember. He said if the right person came, they'd know how to open it. 2 days before he died, and he knew he was dying, the hospice had him on morphine. By then he called me over, made me promise something. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, pressed it into Claire's hand. He said if Claire Brennan ever came, I should tell her that her grandmother's favorite song holds the key. That's all. I don't know what it means, but he made me write it down so I wouldn't forget. Claire looked at the paper. Adelaide's handwriting neat and careful. Grandmother's favorite song equals key. When she looked up, Adelaide was studying her with an expression that might have been pity or might have been respect. What's in the room? The old woman's expression suggested she'd wondered the same thing for years. He never told me, but it was important enough to keep secret even from family. Important enough that people have been trying to get into this house for months. Important enough that Malcolm spent his last coherent hours making sure you'd be able to find it when you arrived. After Adelaide left, refusing to come inside as if the threshold itself represented a line she wouldn't cross, Claire registered Ethan for the local elementary school. He needed normalcy, structure, something to hold on to while their world remained uncertain. The principal had looked at their Maple Street address with raised eyebrows but hadn't asked questions. There was a sadness in his eyes that suggested he'd seen too many families like theirs. Too many children whose lives had been upended by circumstances beyond their control. Ethan started the following Monday, nervous but excited. It gave Claire 6 hours a day to search the house for clues about her grandmother. She started in the living room, moving methodically through drawers and cabinets. Most contained the expected detritus of a long life. Old bills, instruction manuals for appliances that no longer existed, Christmas cards from people probably long dead. But in a cabinet beneath the built-in bookshelves, she found vinyl records stacked beside an old turntable. Most had generic store labels, the kind you got when you recorded from the radio. But one caught her eye. Handwritten text on the sleeve in faded ink, E's favorite, anniversary 1962. E. Evelyn, her grandmother. Claire slid the record from its cover with the reverence of an archaeologist handling an artifact. The vinyl was scratched, but not damaged. She placed it on the turntable, found the power switch, and held her breath as the needle dropped. Static crackled. Then a woman's voice filled the room, singing in Spanish. The melody was haunting, romantic, full of longing. Bésame mucho. Kiss me deeply. A bolero about love and loss, and the way passion fades into memory but never quite disappears. Claire stood in that dusty living room and felt tears slip down her face. This was Evelyn's favorite song. This was what Malcolm had played for her on their anniversary. This was love preserved on vinyl, waiting decades for someone to remember it existed. Ethan appeared in the doorway, drawn by the music. He didn't understand the Spanish words, but he understood the emotion. He danced around the living room, his small body moving to the rhythm, and for a moment Claire could forget about threatening notes and mysterious visitors and houses with secrets in their bones. For a moment she could just watch her son dance. But where was the locked attic room? Adelaide had said Malcolm kept it locked. Claire had explored the entire second floor and found nothing that looked like it might hide a secret room, unless... That night after Ethan was asleep, Claire went to the basement. She'd avoided it during the day, some instinctive reluctance to go underground in a house that already felt like it was trying to swallow her. The basement stairs creaked under her weight. She found a pull-chain light that illuminated a space that was exactly what you'd expect from a 100-year-old house. Unfinished. Concrete floor and exposed beams. A furnace that clanked and groaned. Shadows in corners that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She was searching for the circuit breaker, thinking about the electrical panel Adelaide had mentioned when she heard movement upstairs. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, unable to sleep without her nearby. The separation anxiety had started after David died and hadn't gotten better. Claire called up to him, trying to sound calm. "Come down here, buddy. Help me find the lights." Ethan descended carefully, trailing one hand along the wall. He had her phone, using it as a flashlight, sweeping the beam across dark corners. When the light hit the far wall, he stopped. His observation came out simple, curious the way 5-year-olds notice things adults miss. "Mama, why is that wall different?" Claire moved closer. One section of the basement wall was newer concrete, a different shade than the rest. Not obvious unless you were looking for it, but once you saw it, unmistakable. She tapped it with her knuckles. Hollow sound behind. Her fingers found the edge of something, a seam barely visible where someone had tried to match the texture but couldn't quite hide the fact that this was an addition, not original construction. She pried at it with a screwdriver from Malcolm's toolbox, rusted but functional. The concealed door swung inward with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in years. Behind it, darkness. Claire shined her phone light into the gap and saw a narrow staircase going up. Wooden steps, dusty, leading to somewhere she couldn't see from her angle. Her pulse quickened. The hidden stairway between basement and attic. The locked room Adelaide had mentioned. Malcolm had built this, had kept it secret, had made sure only someone who knew to look would ever find it. Claire climbed with Ethan behind her, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The stairway was barely wide enough for an adult, with walls pressing in on both sides. Claustrophobia threatened, but she pushed through it. At the top, a heavy door with a deadbolt lock. Not the kind you could open with a key. This was a combination lock, 3 sets of numbers waiting to be decoded. She pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Then unmistakably footsteps on the other side. Someone moving. Pacing. Waiting. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing. Whoever was in that room knew she was here. Knew someone had finally found the hidden stairway. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with anticipation. Claire's hands shook as she backed down the stairs. Someone was in that room. Someone was watching them, had been living in the house, and was now trapped or hiding behind that locked door. The guardian who'd left the warning note, the intruder. Adelaide had mentioned. Someone else entirely. She needed the key. Adelaide's message echoed in her mind. Your grandmother's favorite song holds the key. The record. The anniversary date. That had to be it. Back in the living room, Claire examined the record sleeve more carefully. E's favorite. Anniversary 1962. Malcolm had written it himself, she was sure of it. The same shaky handwriting as the journal entries she'd glimpsed in the surveillance room. He'd left clues for her. Had trusted she'd be smart enough to figure them out. Claire found Malcolm's papers in a box in the kitchen, rifled through until she found the marriage certificate. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed document. Malcolm Voss and Evelyn Hartwell married October 15, 1962. The anniversary on the record. That was the key. Back at the hidden staircase, Claire climbed to the locked door with Ethan following close behind. The deadbolt had a combination lock requiring 3 sets of numbers. She tried 10-15-62. Nothing. The lock didn't budge. Then she tried 10-15-1962. The full date. 4 digits, 2 digits, 4 digits. The lock clicked. The door swung inward. Claire pulled the chain for the overhead light, half expecting it not to work. But the bulb flickered, then steadied, revealing what Malcolm had been hiding all these years. The room beyond made her gasp. Walls covered floor to ceiling with photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pinned and taped in overlapping layers that created a mosaic of her entire life. But these weren't normal family photos. They were surveillance images. Claire as a baby in her mother's arms, taken from a distance through what must have been a telephoto lens. Claire as a toddler at a playground, photographed through a chain-link fence. Claire as a teenager walking to school, captured from across the street. Her wedding to David, taken from somewhere in the crowd, his face blurry but hers perfectly in focus. Ethan's birth at the hospital, shot through a window from outside. Someone had been watching her entire life, documenting every moment, building a visual timeline of Claire Brennan from birth to present day. The scope of it was staggering, the dedication frightening. This wasn't casual observation, this was obsession. This was love or madness or something that existed in the space between the two. In the center of the room stood a table with an open journal and a pen beside it. Claire approached with dread pooling in her stomach. The journal was filled with Malcolm's handwriting. She recognized it from the documents she'd signed at the attorney's office, but the dates were wrong. Entries continued months after his death certificate said he'd died in February. The dates went through March, April, May. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago, the same date as the newspaper upstairs. She read with growing horror and understanding. Malcolm had hired a private investigator before his death, someone to watch over Claire after their estrangement. He'd been too proud to reach out directly, too ashamed of the years they'd lost. So he'd done this instead, documented her life from a distance, making sure she was safe, hoping she'd eventually come back to the house he'd left her. But the entries after his death were written in the same hand as if someone had continued his work. The handwriting was identical. The same person who'd taken these photos before Malcolm died was still taking them after. Someone Malcolm had trusted with this task. Someone who'd promised to keep watching, keep protecting, keep documenting until Claire came home. The last entry read, "She cannot know until she's ready. The truth is in the fireplace. If you're reading this, Claire, forgive me. What I took from Korea haunts me still. MV." Claire stood in that room surrounded by evidence of surveillance and secret devotion and felt her understanding of everything shift. Malcolm hadn't abandoned her. He'd been watching over her all along too, burdened by pride and guilt to make contact but unable to simply let her go. And someone else, someone who'd known Malcolm, who'd shared his secrets, was still protecting her, still watching, still following instructions given by a dead man. The truth is in the fireplace. Claire knew exactly which fireplace Malcolm meant. The massive stone one in the living room, the focal point of the house. She needed to search it. Now. Downstairs, Claire and Ethan attacked the living room fireplace with urgency born of too many unanswered questions. She'd grabbed the fireplace broom from its stand, started sweeping out decades of ash and debris. The broom hit something solid behind the andirons. Not brick, not stone. Something that moved when she pushed it. Claire pulled out the andirons, completely tossed them aside with a clang that made Ethan jump. Then she reached into the darkness, her hands finding loose bricks that shifted under pressure. She pulled them out one by one, stacking them on the floor, reaching deeper until her fingers touched canvas. Military canvas, rough and aged. The duffel bag came out heavy, dusty, smelling of decades locked away from light and air. Inside the bag sat a wooden trunk about 2 feet by 3, dark wood with tarnished metal corners. The craftsmanship was beautiful, even under the grime dovetail joints, hand-carved details along the edges. This wasn't some mass-produced storage box. Someone had built this with care, with the intention that it would last generations. The trunk had a lock, but the key hung on a nail inside the hiding space, exactly where someone had left it to be found. Claire's hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock. It turned with a click that seemed too loud in the quiet house, as if the house itself was holding its breath to see what secrets would emerge. The lid opened slowly, hinges protesting years of disuse with a squeal that set Claire's teeth on edge. Inside, the past waited with the patience of things that know they'll eventually be remembered. Photographs came first. Hundreds of them, some loose, some in albums with crumbling pages that threatened to disintegrate if handled too roughly. Malcolm and Evelyn on their wedding day, so young they looked like children playing dress-up. He wore his army uniform, fresh-faced and hopeful. She wore a simple white dress and held a bouquet of daisies, her smile brighter than the sun-washed background. More photos: Malcolm in military uniform, Korean War, from the dates written on the back in faded pencil. Evelyn pregnant, laughing, one hand on her swollen belly while the other shaded her eyes from the sun. Claire's mother being born, wrapped in hospital blankets, eyes closed in infant sleep. Birthdays with homemade cakes. Holidays with a tree visible in the background. Graduations, elementary, middle, high school. A visual timeline of lives fully lived, of moments captured and preserved, as if Malcolm had known someday they would matter to someone who hadn't been there. Each photo was labeled in Evelyn's neat handwriting: Malcolm's homecoming 1954. Our first house 1956. Emma's first day of kindergarten 1960. Emma, Claire's mother. The woman who'd forbidden contact with Malcolm and died before making peace with that decision. Below the photographs, letters tied with faded ribbons that had once been blue but had aged to a color closer to gray. Claire untied the ribbon carefully, afraid it would crumble, and unfolded the first letter. Malcolm's handwriting, bold and romantic, even when describing mundane things. "My dearest Evelyn," it began. "Today we marched 20 miles in full gear. My feet have blisters on top of blisters, but all I can think about is coming home to you. I dream about your smile, about the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, about the life we're going to build together when this war is finally over." Evelyn's responses were equally tender, full of longing and everyday details about gardens and neighbors and the child growing inside her. "The baby kicked today," she wrote in one letter, "right during church service. I think she was protesting the sermon too long and not enough substance, just like her father." The intimacy of them made Claire feel like an intruder reading someone's diary, but she couldn't stop. These were the pieces of her family she'd never known existed, fragments of love that had survived decades in darkness, waiting for someone to witness them. Wrapped in cloth beneath the letters were things of value. A silver locket with photographs of Malcolm and Evelyn inside their faces, young and hopeful. The locket was tarnished, but the hinge still worked, springing open to reveal 2 tiny portraits that must have been cut from larger photographs. Military medals in a velvet case that had protected them from tarnish. Bronze star and Purple Heart among them, along with campaign ribbons Claire didn't recognize. Her grandfather had been wounded in combat, decorated for valor. Details she'd never known. Details no one had thought to tell her. A gold watch, heavy and expensive despite its age, engraved on the back in Spanish: "El tiempo es precioso, gástalo con amor." Time is precious, spend it with love. The engraving was worn from years of Malcolm's thumb rubbing over it, a nervous habit perhaps, or a reminder to himself of what mattered. A simple gold ring worn smooth from decades on someone's finger. Evelyn's wedding band, Claire realized. The one she'd worn until the day she died. Malcolm had kept it, couldn't bear to part with it, even when everything else of hers had been distributed or discarded. At the very bottom of the trunk, a small wooden box that fit in Claire's palm. The wood was dark, polished, smooth, with inlay work that suggested it had been made somewhere far from America. Korea, perhaps. Or Japan. Claire opened it with the sense that this was the most valuable thing in the trunk. Inside, a bracelet set with small emeralds that caught the light and threw green fire across the walls. Earrings that might be diamonds, the stones old cut and brilliant. A brooch shaped like a bird with eyes that glittered, rubies maybe, or garnets. A string of pearls that had yellowed with age but still held their luster, perfectly matched in size and shape. These weren't costume jewelry. These were real valuable things her grandparents had kept hidden for hard times that never came, or to pass down to descendants they'd never met. Evelyn's treasures saved and protected and waiting. And beneath it all, an envelope with her name written in shaky handwriting, Claire Brennan, in careful script, the letters formed by a hand that had started to fail but refused to give up. She opened it with trembling fingers, her vision already blurring with tears. She couldn't stop. Malcolm's letter started with an apology that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than words could reach. My dearest Claire, my sweet granddaughter, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found your way home. I know we were apart for so many years. I know there was hurt and pride and stupid family fights that kept us from knowing each other the way we should have. The handwriting wavered as if written by someone whose hands no longer obeyed perfectly. I wanted to reach out so many times, but I was a stubborn old man who didn't know how to heal old wounds. By the time I realized how foolish I'd been, how much time I'd wasted, I was too sick to do anything about it. The doctors gave me 6 months. That was 8 months ago. I'm running on borrowed time now, time I'm using to make sure you'll be taken care of when I'm gone. Claire's vision blurred, but she kept reading, hungry for connection with the grandfather she'd lost twice, once to pride, once to death. So instead of reaching out, instead of risking rejection or making things worse, I did the only thing I could. I made sure this house would go to you, that when you needed it most, it would be here waiting. I had lawyers set it up so it couldn't go to anyone else. You're the only heir I named. If you didn't claim it, it would sit empty until you did. The next section made Claire's chest tighten. This house, these walls, they hold so much love. Your grandmother and I built our life here. We raised your mother here, watched her grow from baby to woman. Every room has memories. Every corner has laughter hidden in it. We weren't rich people. We worked hard, saved what we could, lived simply. But we were happy. We had love, and that was enough. More than enough. Malcolm's instructions came with the weight of understanding what poverty felt like. The things in this trunk are all for you. The jewelry was your grandmother's, and she always wanted you to have it. She talked about you all the time, wondered what you looked like if you had her eyes, her smile. She died hoping she'd see you again. She made me promise I'd find a way to give you these pieces to let you know she thought of you even when we couldn't be in your life. The letter continued, keep what you want, sell what you need. I won't judge. I know life is hard and sometimes you need practical things more than sentiment. The medals are from a war I tried to forget but never could. I'm not proud of what I did over there, but I'm proud I survived, that I came home to your grandmother and got to build this life. If they mean something to you, keep them. If not, that's okay too. Malcolm's tone shifted, became heavier. This house is old and needs work. People in town will tell you stories about ghosts and strange happenings. Pay them no mind. The only spirits here are the good kind. Memories of love and family. I hope this place gives you shelter when you need it. I hope it keeps you safe and warm. I hope you can feel in these walls that you are loved, that you have always been loved, that you will always be loved. The closing broke something inside Claire that she hadn't known was still whole. I'm sorry I never got to know you as an adult. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to fix what was broken. But I hope this helps. I hope you find peace here. Your grandmother and I, we will be watching over you wherever we are. Come home, sweetheart. You've always been welcome here. With all my love, your Grandpa Malcolm. Claire sat on the dusty floor of the living room surrounded by scattered treasures and sobbed. Great heaving cries that came from somewhere deep in her chest, releasing months of grief and fear and loneliness. She cried for David and the life they'd lost. She cried for Malcolm and all the years they could have had together. She cried for Evelyn, who she barely remembered but who had loved her anyway. She cried from exhaustion and relief and gratitude and overwhelm. When Ethan woke from his nap and found her still sitting there among the photographs and jewelry, he crawled into her lap without a word. His small body fit perfectly against hers, his weight solid and real, and the one thing anchoring her to the present. His small voice carried confusion and concern. "Why are you sad, Mama?" Claire held him tighter, her words muffled against his hair. "Not sad, baby. These are happy tears." He processed this with the logic of 5-year-olds who'd learned that adults could cry for reasons that didn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. But he hugged her anyway, and that was all that mattered. That night, after Ethan was asleep in one of the upstairs bedrooms on a mattress she'd dragged down from the attic, Claire spread the jewelry on the kitchen table under the overhead bulb. She had no idea what any of it was worth, but she knew it was more than the $17 in her pocket. This was her lifeline. Malcolm's final gift. The practical part of her brain screamed to sell it all, immediately pay the property taxes, buy food, have a cushion for emergencies. But another part, smaller but growing stronger, whispered that she should wait, that she should appreciate what this meant. These weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of Evelyn things she'd worn and loved. Pieces of family history that could never be replaced once sold. But what good was history if you were starving? What good was sentiment if you couldn't keep the lights on? Claire photographed each piece with her phone, careful to capture every angle. Then she used the library's Wi-Fi still saved in her settings from the weeks they'd spent there to research values online. The results made her hands shake. The emerald bracelet, $12,000 to $15,000 based on similar pieces at auction. The diamond earrings, $8,000 to $10,000 for estate jewelry from that era. The pearls, $5,000 minimum for a matched set of that quality. The brooch harder to estimate without knowing the maker, but similar pieces sold for $6,000 to $8,000. Thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands. Enough to survive, enough to breathe, enough to give Ethan stability while Claire figured out what came next. As she put the jewelry back in the trunk, her fingers touched something she'd missed before. Another note hidden under the fabric lining at the very bottom. Different handwriting, not Malcolm's. The paper newer, the ink darker. Claire unfolded it with a sense of inevitability, as if she'd known all along there would be more. The message was brief, but loaded with implication. The jewelry will help you survive, but the real treasure is still hidden. Keep searching. You're closer than you think. Your guardian. Claire stared at those words until the light outside faded to black. Someone was still watching. Someone knew what she'd found. Someone wanted her to find more. And that someone, whoever they were, had just made one thing clear: this house held more secrets than a trunk full of jewelry and love letters. But first, she needed to turn sentiment into survival. The morning after finding the second mysterious note, Claire took the jewelry to 3 different establishments. She'd marked them on a map during her library research, planning her route like a military operation because gas was precious and she couldn't afford wasted trips. First stop was a pawn shop on the east side with bars on the windows and a neon sign that flickered between open and darkness. The owner barely glanced at the pieces before announcing $4,000 for everything, his eyes never leaving his phone screen where some sports game played. Claire walked out without a word. She'd expected lowballing, but that was insulting. The jewelry store in the nicer part of town treated her better. A woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain examined each piece under magnification, commenting on the quality of the emeralds and the craftsmanship of the settings. She offered $8,000. Better, but Claire sensed there was more value here than anyone was acknowledging. Something in the way the woman's fingers lingered on the bracelet, the way her expression shifted when she thought Claire wasn't watching. The antique dealer worked out of a small shop tucked between a bakery and a tax office. The smell of fresh bread competed with the must of old things. An older gentleman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain greeted her with genuine warmth that felt practiced but sincere. He spent nearly an hour examining each piece using a jeweler's loupe to check stones, testing metal purity with acids that left tiny marks Claire hoped wouldn't affect the value, consulting thick reference books that looked as old as the jewelry itself. Finally, he looked up with an expression that combined professional appreciation and personal empathy. His voice carried the careful precision of someone delivering important news. "This bracelet alone is worth $12,000, possibly more to the right collector. The emeralds are natural Colombian stones, quite fine quality. The earrings are estate pieces, probably 1920s based on the setting style, worth another $8,000. The brooch is unusual. The bird design suggests it might be a specific maker. I'd need to research further, but I'd estimate $6,000. The pearls are genuine and exceptionally well matched, worth at least $5,000. He paused, letting the numbers settle. "Altogether, I could offer you $32,000 right now, or I could take them on consignment and try to get you closer to $40,000, though that might take several months." Claire had to sit down. $32,000. The number seemed impossible, a sum of money she'd never held in her hands or seen in any account she'd ever owned. That was a year of rent in a decent apartment, a reliable car time to find a real job without desperation clouding every interview. Safety. The thing she'd been chasing since David died. Her voice shook despite her attempt at control. "How fast can you have the 32,000? The dealer's expression was gentle understanding in a way that suggested he'd seen desperate people before and knew the difference between need and greed. "I can write you a check right now. The pieces are clearly yours based on the estate documentation you've shown me. The craftsmanship and age make them legitimate historical items, and frankly, I'll make a profit even at this price." He leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more personal. "But I want you to be sure. Family heirlooms once sold rarely come back. This isn't just jewelry, it's your grandmother's legacy, your grandfather's gift to you. Take a moment. Be certain." Claire thought about Evelyn wearing these pieces at special occasions, about Malcolm hiding them in a trunk behind bricks, keeping them safe for a granddaughter he hoped would someday need them. She thought about Ethan asking if they could have pancakes for breakfast, and her having to say no because they didn't have syrup or butter to make them properly. She thought about the $17 that stood between them and complete destitution. Malcolm's words echoed in her mind. "Sell what you need. I won't judge. I know life is hard and sometimes you need practical things more than sentiment." Her decision came out steady, final. "I'm sure." The check felt surreal in her hand when the dealer passed it across his desk. So much money represented by a thin slip of paper. She signed documents, received the dealer's card in case she ever found anything else, and shook his hand. His grip conveyed respect, not pity. A small distinction, but one that mattered more than Claire could express. Walking to her car, she felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because the weight of immediate desperation had lifted. Heavier because she'd just sold pieces of family history, chosen survival over sentiment. But Malcolm's letter had given her permission, had understood that sometimes love means letting go of things to hold on to what matters more. First stop, county tax office, in a building that smelled of old paper and fluorescent lights. She paid the property taxes, $1,400 plus penalties that had accumulated during the 8 months the house sat empty. The clerk seemed surprised when Claire provided the Maple Street address, checked it twice in her computer before stamping the receipt with a satisfied thump. The house was officially, legally, completely hers now. No one could take it away. The deed was in her name. Next came the bank, where she deposited the remaining $30,600 into an account that had been down to its last $16. The teller's eyes widened at the amount, but processed the transaction without comment. though Claire noticed her glance at the security guard as if checking whether this warranted concern. Claire sat in her car afterward in the bank parking lot, staring at the balance printed on the receipt at the comma that separated thousands from hundreds, and cried again. Pure relief this time, untainted by grief or fear. She took Ethan shopping. Not to thrift stores or dollar stores, but to Target, where she bought him clothes that actually fit, instead of being 2 sizes too big for growing room they couldn't afford. A winter coat that was his size and wouldn't swallow him. Shoes without holes worn through the soles. She bought groceries, real food, fresh vegetables and fruit and meat and milk. Cleaning supplies to tackle the years of accumulated grime. Light bulbs to replace the ones that had burned out. Things to make the house not just habitable, but livable. For Ethan, she bought the Lego set he'd been staring at in store windows for months and a stuffed animal to keep Max company. That night they ate dinner at their kitchen table. Spaghetti with sauce from a jar that cost more than $1. Garlic bread made from real butter. Salad with dressing. Ethan talked about starting school the next week, about being nervous, but excited about a boy named Tommy who'd shown him where the bathroom was. Claire listened and smiled and felt for the first time in forever like maybe things would actually be okay. But even as she smiled, even as she watched Ethan demolish his dinner with the enthusiasm of a child who'd gone hungry too often, the note haunted her. The real treasure is still hidden. What had Malcolm taken from Korea? What was worth more than $32,000 in jewelry? And who was this guardian who knew Malcolm's secrets and continued his work after death? Claire waited until Ethan was asleep before returning to the attic room. The surveillance photos still covered the walls, but now she studied them differently, not as evidence of invasion, but as proof of protection. Someone had cared enough to document her life to make sure she was safe, even when she didn't know they existed. The thought was both comforting and unsettling in equal measure. She searched the room methodically, looking for anything she might have missed. Behind one of the photographs, her high school graduation taken from somewhere in the crowd, she found a small wooden box wedged between wall studs. Inside was a collection of documents: Malcolm's military service records, deployment papers, commendation letters, written in formal military language that praised his dedication and discretion. And tucked between them, a journal entry on loose paper written in Malcolm's younger handwriting dated November 1953. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. Claire read by the light of her phone, her hands trembling. The entry started with coordinates and a location in Seoul. Malcolm described his unit securing a warehouse full of items looted during the Japanese occupation of Korea. Art artifacts, cultural treasures stolen and hidden during decades of colonial rule. Official inventory was supposed to happen immediately, but chaos reigned in post-war Korea. In the confusion, several pieces went missing before proper documentation could be completed. Malcolm's guilt bled through the words, "I took something. I don't know why. Fear, maybe, or greed disguised as preservation. I told myself I was saving it from being lost again in the chaos, but I was lying to myself. I was stealing. For 70 years I've carried this weight, this shame. The item belongs to the Korean people. It should have been returned decades ago, but I was too afraid of the consequences, too proud to admit my crime." The entry ended with a promise written in darker ink, as if added years later. "If I can't make this right myself, I'll ensure someone else can. I'll prepare everything needed for proper repatriation. I'll leave instructions. I'll make sure the truth comes out even if it's after I'm gone. This is my burden to bear, but it doesn't have to be my legacy." Claire sat in the attic room, surrounded by surveillance photos and military records, and understood the scope of what Malcolm had left her. Not just a house and jewelry and love letters, a mission, a chance to complete what he'd started to turn his mistake into redemption. But first, she needed to find what he'd hidden, and she needed help. The flyer appeared in her mailbox 3 days later, as if summoned by her need. Garrett Sullivan, handyman and contractor. Honest work, fair prices. specializing in historic home restoration. It included before and after photos of Victorian houses transformed from ruins to showcases, licensing information, and a phone number. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidence, but Claire was running out of options and the house genuinely needed professional help. She called, half expecting a voicemail that would never be returned. Garrett answered on the second ring. His voice carried the rough edges of someone who worked with his hands and didn't waste words on things that didn't matter. He agreed to come by that afternoon for an estimate. He arrived in an older Ford pickup that showed wear but had been well maintained. Early 40s, Claire guessed, with the kind of lean muscle that came from actual physical labor rather than gym workouts. His hands were weathered when he shook hers, scarred from years of construction work. His tool belt was worn smooth in places from constant use, the leather shaped to his body like a second skin. Before she could say anything about what needed fixing, he was walking the property perimeter, taking notes on a clipboard, photographing problems with his phone. A professional documenting the scope of work before discussing price. He moved with purpose, testing porch boards with his weight, examining foundation cracks with a critical eye, peering into gutters from a ladder he'd pulled from his truck. When he finally approached the porch where Claire waited with Ethan, his assessment was thorough and brutal. His words came rapid fire, each one a small blow to her hopes of easy fixes. Foundation cracks on the north side, probably due to water damage from those collapsed gutters. Roof needs 15 to 20 shingles replaced, maybe more once I get up there and see the underlayment. Porch joists are rotting, you're lucky you haven't fallen through yet. Electrical panel is from the 1960s, which is honestly a miracle you haven't had a fire. Plumbing's copper, that's good, but the main line might be compromised based on the settling I'm seeing. He paused, flipping through his notes. Estimate for critical repairs is $18,000 to $22,000. Cosmetic work would be another $15,000 on top of that. Claire's brief sense of security evaporated. She'd just gotten $32,000. After taxes, groceries, and Ethan's clothes, she had maybe $28,000 left. The numbers Garrett quoted would consume everything with no cushion for emergencies. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I have some money, but not that much. Garrett's tone was matter-of-fact, not judgmental, just gathering information. What's your budget? Claire did the math in her head, leaving herself enough for 2 months of food and basic utilities. Maybe $8,000 for now. Garrett studied the house, then her, then Ethan, who was watching from the doorway with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult stress in voices and faces. Something shifted in Garrett's expression. A decision being made behind eyes that had seen their share of hardship. His proposal came measured, practical. Okay, priority 1 has to be the electrical panel. $2,500 because that's genuinely dangerous. Priority 2 is foundation stabilization on that north wall. $3,000 to prevent it from getting worse. Priority 3 is patching the roof. $1,500 to stop water intrusion. That's $7,000. Leaves you $1,000 buffer for anything we find once we open things up. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. I can do the cosmetic work on weekends for cost of materials if you're willing to help and learn as we go. Sound fair? Claire's suspicious nature kicked in, sharpened by months of people taking advantage or offering help that came with hidden costs and expectations she couldn't meet. Why would you do that? Garrett hesitated, his gaze drifting to the house rather than meeting her eyes. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old debts. I knew Mr. Voss. He helped me once when I needed it. Figure I owe him. Over the next 3 weeks, Garrett worked on the critical repairs while Claire helped when Ethan was at school. She learned the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, how to test electrical connections without getting shocked, the proper way to apply joint compound so it wouldn't crack when it dried. Practical skills she'd never needed when David was alive, and contractors were people you hired, not became. Garrett didn't talk much during work. He'd explain what needed doing, demonstrate once with patient precision, then hand her the tools and let her try. When she made mistakes, and she made plenty, he'd correct without judgment, showing her again until muscle memory took over from uncertainty. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the sounds of hammers and saws, and the house slowly remembering what it felt like to be cared for. On day 4, while they were running new wiring through the attic crawlspace, Garrett mentioned his wife for the first time. His voice stayed level factual, but Claire heard the grief underneath like a bass note sustaining through a melody. Emma died 4 years ago. Cancer. Fought it for 18 months before her body just couldn't anymore. Claire kept feeding him wire through the joists, understanding that kind of loss needed space, not platitudes. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the scrape of metal on wood as he threaded the wire through holes he'd drilled. "After she was gone, I kept working because I didn't know what else to do. But it didn't mean anything anymore. Just became a way to fill hours until I could sleep, wake up, do it again. Stopped taking pride in the work. Stopped caring if it was right or just good enough." The confession carried weight because Garrett didn't seem like someone who shared easily. Claire recognized the shape of his grief because she wore the same one. Two people who'd lost their reasons for getting up in the morning, now rebuilding a house that had waited decades for someone to remember it, was worth saving. Day 10 brought a shift. The electrical panel was replaced, and the foundation stabilization was nearly complete. Claire noticed how Garrett would sometimes stand in doorways studying the craftsmanship of the original woodwork with appreciation that went beyond professional assessment. He'd run his fingers along carved molding test, the weight of solid oak doors, examine joinery that had held for over a century. When she asked about it, his answer came thoughtful. "Your grandfather loved this house. You can tell by how he maintained it even when he got too old to do the heavy work himself. Every repair was done right, not just good enough. He used proper materials, took his time. That's rare. Most people take shortcuts, use whatever's cheapest. But Malcolm, he treated this place like it deserved respect." By day 14, they'd developed a rhythm. Claire would arrive after dropping Ethan at school, and she and Garrett would work until it was time for pickup. Sometimes they'd eat lunch together on the porch sandwiches Claire made from the groceries she could now afford. Garrett would point out architectural details she'd missed, a hand-carved rosette in the soffit original hardware on the door's crown molding that had been milled specifically for this house. He taught her to see the house the way he did, not as a collection of problems to be fixed, but as a structure with history and character. "See this door frame," he said one afternoon, running his hand along the jamb. "Look how it's mortised and tenoned, no nails. Just wood fitted together so precisely it's held for 100 years. They don't build like this anymore. Can't afford to. But your grandfather made sure nothing got replaced with something cheap. Kept the integrity." Day 18 changed everything. They were painting the repaired sections of exterior wall when Claire mentioned finding strange things in the attic. Her words came casual, testing how much she could reveal. "Surveillance photos. Journal entries dated after my grandfather supposedly died. It's like someone's been watching me my whole life." Garrett dropped the paint roller. It clattered against the ladder, leaving a streak of white down his jeans. His face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the November cold. When he spoke, his voice came tight with something that might have been fear or might have been relief. "What kind of photos?" Claire described them. The distant shots, the chronological documentation, the obsessive thoroughness of someone tracking another person's life from birth to present. The glass of water on the kitchen counter, the newspaper dated 3 days ago, the note warning her to leave. Garrett set down his paint can with deliberate care and pulled out his phone. His thumbs moved fast across the screen, typing something urgent. His next words came rushed. "Claire, I need to tell you something. I should have told you before, but I made a promise. Maybe it's time to break it." He dialed, waited. The conversation was brief, coded in a way that suggested the person on the other end knew exactly what Garrett was really saying. "Hey, Tommy." "Yeah, it's Garrett. Remember you said if I ever needed a favor?" "Good. I need a lawyer. Property dispute. Pro bono if possible." Pause. Claire watched emotions play across his face. Concern, resignation, determination. Maple Street Development. You're kidding. Really? Okay, I'll tell her. Thanks, brother. Garrett hung up and took a breath that seemed to cost him something. When he finally met Claire's eyes, his expression carried the weight of secrets kept too long. I wasn't entirely honest about why I'm helping you. Mr. Voss did help me. That part's true. But 6 months before he died, he hired me for one final project. Claire's stomach tightened, sensing the revelation would reshape everything she thought she understood. What project? His confession came steady, measured like he'd rehearsed this moment. Had me build that hidden staircase you found, reinforce the attic room, install those special locks. Took me 3 weeks working nights so neighbors wouldn't see. He paid me in cash, made me promise not to tell anyone. He said his granddaughter would need a fortress someday, and someone to watch over it after he was gone. The implications hit Claire like physical blows. Malcolm hadn't just documented her life from a distance. He'd prepared for this exact moment, had anticipated she'd need protection, had built defenses into the house itself. The hidden staircase wasn't just about concealing the surveillance room. It was about creating escape routes, safe spaces, architectural armor against threats Malcolm had seen coming. Claire forced the question past the tightness in her throat. "Are you the one who's been in my house? The one who left the warning note?" Garrett shook his head quickly. "No, but I know who is. His name's Thomas Blackwell, retired police detective, served with your grandfather in Korea." The name meant nothing to Claire, but the connection to Korea sent alarm bells through her nervous system. Whatever Malcolm had taken, whatever he'd hidden under that basement concrete, it connected to his military service. And someone who'd been there, who'd shared those experiences, was continuing Malcolm's work of protection. Her next question came sharper. "Protecting me from what?" Garrett crossed to the basement stairs, motioning for her to follow. Downstairs, he pointed to the specific section of foundation that looked newer than the rest. Under the bare bulb's harsh light, the color difference was obvious once you knew to look for it. His explanation came carefully, as if he'd rehearsed this moment, but still wasn't sure how much to reveal. "This wasn't here when I built the staircase. After I finished the attic work, Mr. Voss dismissed me for 2 weeks. Said it was a family emergency, paid me for the time, told me not to come back until he called. When I came back, this section had been poured. He'd done it himself in his 90s. Wouldn't let me help, wouldn't explain. Just said the work was complete and paid me in cash." Claire touched the concrete, feeling its roughness, imagining Malcolm in his 90s mixing and pouring cement alone because the secret was too dangerous to share. The image broke her heart and filled her with questions in equal measure. Garrett wasn't finished. He called me aside before I left that day, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Garrett, if anything happens to me, there's something under this concrete that cannot fall into wrong hands. If someone tries to get to it, if my granddaughter is ever in danger because of what I buried here, you call Thomas Blackwell." He gave me a number, made me memorize it, made me promise. The weight of that promise hung between them. Claire understood now why Garrett had come when he saw her at the house, why he'd offered to work for materials, why he'd invested weeks in helping a stranger. He wasn't working for her. He was fulfilling an obligation to a dead man who'd changed his life 15 years ago with $1,500 and a lesson about integrity. Her voice came barely above a whisper. "What's under there?" Garrett's expression said he'd been hoping she wouldn't ask. He never said. But 2 days before he died, someone broke in. Mr. Voss was staying at the hospice facility by then, but he had the house alarmed. Police responded to the break-in around 3 a.m. When they got here, they found jackhammer marks on this exact spot. Whoever it was had started breaking through but fled when the alarm went off. Claire's mind raced through implications. Someone had known what Malcolm buried, had tried to take it while he was dying. Had failed only because Malcolm had anticipated the attempt, had installed alarms and called in Thomas to guard what he couldn't protect himself anymore. The question formed cold and heavy in her chest. Did they catch who broke in? Garrett shook his head. "No. Professional job. Disabled the cameras, wore gloves, left no prints. But that's when Mr. Voss moved into hospice full-time. He knew they'd come back. Knew he couldn't protect it anymore. That's why he set everything else up, the documentation, the surveillance, the people watching over you. He was preparing for a war he wouldn't live to fight himself. The knock on the door came exactly 1 week after Garrett's confession on a Tuesday afternoon while Garrett was on the roof replacing shingles. Claire opened it to find a man in an expensive suit, silver hair, perfectly styled smile that looked practiced in mirrors and boardroom meetings. His whole presentation screamed money and power and the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. He extended a hand. She didn't take his smile, never wavering. Preston Hargrove, representing Hargrove Development Group. I believe we should talk about your property. Claire kept her voice level, her body blocking the doorway so he couldn't see inside. I'm not interested in selling. Hargrove's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes like a light going out behind a window. He pulled out a folder, flipped it open with the theatrical precision of someone used to making presentations that convinced people to do things against their better judgment. I'm buying this entire block for a townhouse development. Fair market value plus 20%. That's $216,000 cash, 30-day close. You'd be foolish to refuse. The number was substantial, more than Claire had ever imagined having. But something about Hargrove's confidence, the way he assumed she'd capitulate, made her spine straighten. It's not for sale. His tone shifted, became harder underneath the professional veneer. Miss Brennan, please be reasonable. You're the only holdout. We have 8 other properties under contract. You're blocking a $4 million development project. Claire felt her jaw set, felt the stubbornness she'd inherited from Malcolm rising up. Then, develop around me. Now the smile faded, entirely replaced by something calculating. The plot configuration doesn't work without your lot. And frankly, Miss Brennan, I'm aware your grandfather may have left certain historical items on the property. Items that rightfully belong to the Historical Society. Korean artifacts, specifically. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Hargrove knew. Knew about Korea, knew about Malcolm's secret, knew enough to make that knowledge a threat. Claire forced herself to keep breathing normally, to not show the fear that spiked through her nervous system like electricity. She kept her voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Hargrove's expression said he knew she was lying and didn't care. I think you do. And I think you're going to sell. Because things can get very complicated for holdouts who don't cooperate. Property liens, code violations, legal challenges to the estate transfer. I have lawyers who specialize in making problems go away or making them multiply. Your choice. He left a business card on the porch rail and walked away. Claire watched his Mercedes pull out of the driveway, her hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Garrett witnessed the entire exchange from the roof, had climbed down silently, and now stood beside his truck. His voice carried urgency when Hargrove was out of earshot. He's not after the house. He's after what's buried under it. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Claire researched Preston Hargrove online with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing your enemy. The results made her stomach clench. He was listed as a historical artifact collector with a reputation that walked the line between legitimate and criminal. 3 lawsuits for coercion, 2 for fraud, 1 currently pending for theft of Native American artifacts from a private estate. Multiple complaints from homeowners who'd sold to him under pressure, only to discover he'd been after items hidden in walls or buried in basements. One woman described how Hargrove had purchased her deceased father's property only to systematically tear it apart, looking for Civil War memorabilia her father had supposedly collected. Another man claimed Hargrove had fabricated environmental violations to force a sale, then excavated the yard looking for buried Revolutionary War artifacts. The pattern was clear. Hargrove specialized in finding people who owned properties with hidden historical value, then using whatever means necessary, legal or otherwise, to acquire what they had. And he'd set his sights on Maple Street. Claire dug deeper into Malcolm's military records, the ones she'd found in the attic room. Most were standard discharge papers, commendations, deployment orders. But one set of documents caught her attention. Special Recovery Team Seoul, Korea, 1953. Malcolm's unit had been tasked with locating and cataloging stolen art and artifacts after the armistice. Items looted during the Japanese occupation, hidden during the war, now surfacing in the chaos of reconstruction. According to one report, Malcolm's team had secured a warehouse full of items on June 15, 1953. Official inventory was supposed to happen immediately, but the report noted several pieces went missing before proper documentation could be completed. The investigation was inconclusive. In the chaos of post-war Korea, things disappeared. People looked the other way. But here's what made Claire's blood run cold. Malcolm's service record showed a 3-day gap immediately after that warehouse recovery. June 16th through June 18th. No explanation, no documentation, just blank space where a soldier should have been accounted for. In his journal entry from November of that year, Malcolm had confessed to taking something, had called it theft disguised as preservation, had carried the guilt for 70 years. Whatever he'd taken during those missing 3 days was valuable enough that people were still looking for it 7 decades later. Valuable enough to kill for, if the break-in attempt while Malcolm was dying was any indication. The harassment started small the next day, building slowly like a storm gathering strength. Construction trucks parking across Claire's driveway, blocking her in. When she called the number on the truck to complain, she was told it was a mix-up, they'd move immediately, so sorry for the inconvenience. But it happened again 2 days later. And again 3 days after that. Always a different company. Always a sincere apology. Always repeated. Then the early morning work started. Jackhammering at 6 a.m. on the property next door, violating noise ordinances that were supposed to protect residential neighborhoods from exactly this kind of disturbance. Ethan couldn't sleep, showed up at school exhausted and cranky, got in trouble for falling asleep during reading time. Claire called the police, who said it was a civil matter, not much they could do about legal construction work even if the timing was inconvenient. 2 weeks into the harassment, a city building inspector showed up with a clipboard and an attitude that suggested he'd already decided what he'd find. His opening line carried the weight of someone who already knew what he'd find. Anonymous complaint about unpermitted work. Need to examine the repairs. He examined Garrett's electrical panel installation with a critical eye that suggested he was looking for problems rather than verifying compliance. The panel permit was technically in order, properly filed and approved, but he found issues with the porch repair issues that wouldn't have mattered to most inspectors, but gave him leverage. His voice carried bureaucratic finality. Structural changes require an engineer stamp. I'll have to red tag this until you get proper documentation. Garrett kept his voice level, but Claire heard the anger underneath. That's not code requirement for minor repairs under 50 square feet. The inspector's smile was thin, official. New interpretation. Safety first. I'll have to issue a stop work order until you provide engineer certification. He slapped a notice on the door. The cost to hire a structural engineer would be $1,500 Claire didn't want to spend. Money she needed for food and utilities and the 1,000 other expenses that came with bringing a dead house back to life. Anonymous offers started arriving in the mail. Letters with no return address, expensive stationery that screamed corporate money. The first one read, "Final offer $250,000. Expires in 7 days." Claire tore it up. But they kept coming, each one slightly higher, each one more insistent. By the 4th letter, the amount had reached $290,000, and the language had shifted from offer to warning. This is your last chance to sell before things get difficult. Claire sat at her kitchen table surrounded by torn envelopes and wondered how far Hargrove would go. The answer came the following Saturday morning in a way that erased all doubt about his willingness to cross lines. She and Ethan were in the front yard attempting to clear some of the overgrown landscaping, pulling weeds that had taken over what might have been flower beds. A dump truck was backing up on the property next door, supposedly preparing for demolition of the condemned house Hargrove had purchased. Garrett was on the porch repairing the railing they'd been red-tagged for the engineer stamp, having cost exactly $1,500 and 3 days of bureaucratic runaround. The truck's backup alarm beeped steadily as it reversed toward the property line, a sound so common in construction zones that Claire barely registered it. Then it kept reversing, crossing the boundary, heading straight toward where Claire and Ethan knelt among the weeds. Garrett saw it first. His shout carried pure alarm. "Hey, stop!" The truck didn't stop. Claire grabbed Ethan and tried to move, but her foot caught on a root buried in the overgrowth. The truck was 10 feet away, then 5. She could see the driver's face in the side mirror. He was looking right at her, not startled, not surprised, watching with the cold calculation of someone following orders, someone who'd been paid to make this look like an accident. Garrett vaulted off the porch and yanked both of them sideways with split-second timing born from construction site reflexes. The truck's bumper missed Ethan by inches, crashed through the fence with a sound of splintering wood, finally stopped with a grinding of brakes that came too late to be accidental. The driver jumped out, hands up in a performance of shock that fooled no one who'd seen his face in that mirror. "Oh my God, I didn't see you. My brakes failed. I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" Claire's voice came out as a scream, all the fear and rage of the past weeks exploding out of her like a physical force. "You could have killed us. Police came, took statements, wrote up their report with the careful neutrality of people who'd seen too much to believe in coincidences but couldn't prove intent without evidence that wouldn't exist. Mechanical failure, they concluded after examining the truck. An accident. Unfortunate, but these things happen. No criminal charges." The driver went home. The truck was towed. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But Garrett examined the truck before the tow arrived, crawling underneath with a flashlight, while Claire held Ethan on the porch, both of them still shaking. When he emerged, his jeans were dirty, and his expression was stone. "These brakes are fine. Fluid's full pads have plenty of material, no leaks. This was deliberate." The words hung between them like a verdict. Hargrove had escalated from annoyance to intimidation to attempted harm, had crossed the line from business tactics to criminal violence, and if he was willing to endanger a 5-year-old boy to get what he wanted, there was no telling how far he'd go. That night at 11, long after the adrenaline had faded and left Claire hollow and shaking, a knock on the door made her freeze. Ethan was asleep upstairs. Garrett had gone home an hour ago after triple-checking all the locks and making her promise to call if anything seemed wrong. She approached with her phone ready to dial 911, every nerve screaming danger. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Who's there?" The answer carried the weight of long-kept promises and patient vigils. "Thomas Blackwell. I believe Garrett mentioned me." Claire opened the door to find a man in his late 60s with military bearing and eyes that had seen things most people only read about in history books. He looked exactly like what she'd imagined a retired detective would, weathered but sharp kind, but guarded someone who'd spent a career reading people and situations and knowing when to act. His first words were an apology that felt genuine. "I'm sorry about the surveillance photos. It was your grandfather's dying wish that someone watch over you. My name's Thomas Blackwell. Malcolm and I served together in Korea. I promised him I'd protect you when the time came. That time is now."